You won't believe how fast the silence of 20 years can break when money suddenly enters the picture. For 2 decades, my son treated me like a ghost. No phone calls, no replies, not even a card when the holidays came around. Every gift I sent was returned unopened, stamped in red like a reminder that I no longer belonged in his life. Then, out of nowhere, after I became wealthy, he invited me to spend Christmas with him. He acted as though nothing had happened, but I already knew this wasn't about family. It was about opportunity. And I was ready with a plan of my own. When I walked into his house that night, the glow of the chandelier bounced across the table. Every glass and fork lined up with mathematical precision. Smiles stretched wide, but I could see the truth beneath them. They weren't waiting for me. They were waiting for what they thought I would bring. Their eyes lit up when I mentioned I had a surprise. They were certain it was a check, a gift with their names written on it. But when the moment arrived, their faces drained of color, every grin dissolving like frost in the sun. To understand how I ended up in that living room, coat still in hand, watching my son and his wife mask their greed behind rehearsed warmth, you need to know what those 20 years of silence did to me. It all started with a phone call one bitter December night in Santa Cruz. The kind of cold where the air cuts at your lungs and the streets look carved from glass. I had just finished a simple dinner and poured a glass of wine when the phone rang. At first, I thought about letting it go to voicemail, telemarketers, wrong numbers, or someone who wanted something where all I usually got. Then I saw the name, Diego Reyes. My son. My hand froze. 2 decades of emptiness, and now this? I answered, steady on the outside, but a storm inside. Papa, his voice said, older now, but with that same blend of charm and calculation he'd carried since boyhood. For a moment, it felt like hearing a memory out loud. He laughed lightly, like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. It's been too long. Mariana and I thought maybe you'd like to join us for Christmas dinner. Family time. Family time. The words landed heavy in my chest. He'd made sure I had none for half my life, and now suddenly he wanted it back? I let him talk, painting a picture of warmth and laughter, prime rib, and children at the table, like a salesman dressing up a broken product. And then, almost casually, he slipped in the real reason. I heard you've been doing really well, that big property deal. Congratulations. There it was. Not reconciliation. Not guilt. Money. I agreed, but not without letting him stew a moment. I'll be there, I said evenly. Then, after a pause, and I have a surprise for you. His laugh softened, eager, greedy. That's great, Papa. Can't wait. We hung up, and the air in my kitchen felt different. Outside, snow drifted thick and steady, covering every trace of what came before, the way silence had buried me for 20 years. On the table sat the manila folder I had been building long before his call. Bank statements, property records, social media printouts, photographs I'd taken myself. I wasn't walking into that house unprepared. I thought of the years I spent alone, birthdays ignored, holidays in silence, letters returned unopened. Every memory stung, but each one sharpened my resolve. I realized long ago that the best way to answer betrayal wasn't rage. It was patience. That patience became the plan. On Christmas Eve, I dressed carefully, polished shoes, clean shave, navy sweater. I wanted to look like a man who had nothing to hide. Driving through the streets, I saw houses glowing with lights, snow reflecting red and green from porches, laughter spilling faintly into the night. Diego's neighborhood looked newer, rows of identical houses dressed in holiday charm. His was lit just enough to look inviting, not enough to look expensive. When I pulled up, I saw silhouettes moving through the window. He opened the door before I even knocked, smile bright, voice smooth, pretending as though we'd spoken every week. Papa, you made it. Come in. Mariana followed close behind, perfume arriving a step before her. Lips parted in that polished smile. So good to see you. Manuel, you look prosperous. I returned the smile, but not for them. Thank you for having me, I said. I brought something special. Their eyes met in a flicker, confirming exactly what I already knew. They thought I was there to hand them a fortune wrapped in generosity. But what I carried in my briefcase wasn't a gift. It was the truth. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted meat. Ambition dressed as comfort. The tree glimmered with perfect ornaments. Gifts arranged like a store display. Years of real estate had trained me to read a room the way a surgeon reads an x-ray. And this one was easy. Too polished, too practiced. This wasn't a family gathering. It was theater. And then I saw them. 2 teenagers on the couch. Sophia and Matteo, my grandchildren in theory, but strangers in reality. They glanced up with polite half-smiles before sinking back into the glow of their phones. No curiosity, no recognition. You can't miss someone you never knew. The sight of them pulled me back 20 years, to the night I lost Diego for good. It had been another December. Money was tight, my construction work slowing down, but I made sure his car had gas, his insurance was paid, and that he had the sneakers he wanted. Even selling my old watch to make it happen. I thought that was what fathers did. But when I came home one snowy night, I heard voices in the kitchen. His mother, Elena, and her new man, Ricardo Vargas, the manager from her office. The words I heard that night cut deeper than any winter wind. "We're making changes." Elena said, "I'm moving in with Ricardo, and Diego is coming with us." I looked at my son, hoping for a flicker of loyalty, of hesitation, but his eyes were cold. "Mom's right. You're stuck. Always saying things will get better, but they never do. I'm tired of waiting." That was the night everything broke. Elena got the house, the car, and Diego's loyalty. I got an apartment with thin walls and silence for company. Christmas gifts came back unopened, until eventually I stopped sending them. And now here he was, 2 decades later, clapping his hands like a host eager to entertain. "Come on, let's eat," he said, steering me toward a table set with 12 perfect place settings, laughter rehearsed and polished like the silverware. But I wasn't there for the meal. I was there for the moment he least expected, the moment when I would open my case and show him what patience had built. Ethan sat across from me, shoulders tense, his eyes flicking between the envelopes like they carried different kinds of poison. His voice cracked as he asked if I was doing all of this just to humiliate him. I didn't raise mine. Instead, I slid the plain white envelope forward, watching his fingers hesitate before pinching the corner. When he opened it and read, the color drained from his face like someone was dimming the room. Maddie leaned in, searching his expression, then took the page from his trembling hand. Her lips parted, closed, then parted again before she whispered that I couldn't have done this. But I had. The mortgage he thought was safe was now mine. Not stolen, not tricked, purchased. I told him the bank had been happy to cut a deal, to trade their problem for a discount and a quick return to holiday champagne. The silence between us wasn't peace. It was panic trying to find a way out. Ethan said I couldn't do that. Maddie called it extortion. I called it housekeeping. Their mess, my broom. I set 2 stacks of documents on the table. The thick pile for the long road of foreclosure, humiliation, neighbors watching, children asking questions they shouldn't have to. And then the slim, elegant stack, the short road, signed tonight, walk away without the public spectacle, no foreclosure stain on their record. I told them I would take the debt. They could find a rental. Somewhere quieter, somewhere the kids wouldn't have to answer whispers at the bus stop. Maddie's voice cracked that this wasn't a gift. I disagreed. It was just not for them, for their children, who deserved doors that stayed half open rather than slammed shut. Ethan pressed his palms into his eyes like he could rub away the weight. When he looked at me again, his voice had shrunk to something small and raw, asking why I was doing this. "Revenge?" he guessed. "Clarity," I said. "Revenge shouts. Clarity whispers." Maddie straightened, forcing dignity back into her spine, vowing they could fight. I told her she could spend money they didn't have on lawyers who would tell them to sign anyway, or they could sign tonight, call a small flood in the basement, and serve their guest dinner while the roast was still warm. Her eyes narrowed, searching for a trap. I stayed still. The traps had been set decades ago. I laid down the final terms. Distance. They would sign, and I wouldn't pursue the unpaid taxes or alert the in-laws or investors he had lied to. I would disappear, and in return, they would not drag me back with rumors or pleas. And they would tell their children the truth about me, Not the saint when they needed something, not the villain when it was convenient. Just the truth. A flawed man who had loved his son more than his son ever loved him back. That was the deal, the deed, and the truth. From the hallway, I saw the outline of Ava's shoulder, a child half aware of the drama behind the cracked door. I didn't turn. I didn't want to fold her into this stage play. I only wanted her to know enough to remember honesty later. Maddie's protest weakened, caught between her throat and her heart. Ethan's breathing steadied into a rhythm that said he'd already decided. He picked up the pen like it was heavier than steel, looked at me once, and signed. Maddie tried to stop him, begged to wait, but he slid the paper toward her. Her accusation was sharp. You're enjoying this. My answer was flat. I'm surviving it. She signed, and I gathered the pages, tucking them away with the kind of care you only use when closing a chapter you'll never open again. The room expanded when the ink dried. Air came back into the walls. Ethan asked what happened now. His voice stripped down to boyhood. I told him to go back to his guests, to let his children unwrap their gifts, to start looking for rentals tomorrow. He asked about me. I told him I would put away the folder and go home. Maddie's eyes had turned to glass, hard and cold, reflecting nothing back. I left them there, standing in the wreckage of their pride, and opened the door to the warmth and noise of the dining room. Laughter spilled out, clinking glasses masking the fracture that had just been sealed in ink. Ava stood nearby with a glass of water, watching me with quiet curiosity. She nodded once. I nodded back. No cruelty, no pity, just understanding. No one followed me to the door. No one called my name. No one asked if I wanted coffee. Perfect. Outside, snow drifted lazy and slow, each flake choosing where to land. I paused on the porch, staring at the golden squares of their windows, each one glowing like a stage where another version of family was still being performed. I felt no urge to tear down their curtain. I brushed snow from my car, started the engine, and waited for the heater to stumble into life. The radio hummed into a carol, Silent Night, and I almost laughed at the timing. The folder sat beside me on the passenger seat, the signed deed pressed to the front. I could feel the grooves of the pen strokes under my fingertips, proof of their choice and mine. In the mirror, the house blurred through a fogged windshield until it was only light behind glass. I thought I saw Ethan there, a shadow at the window, but when I wiped the glass clear, it was only the tree. I drove through streets buried in snow, stopping at a red light, the folder breathing quietly beside me. People say revenge fills you. It doesn't. It only stops the leak. The rest, whatever the rest, is you have to build with your own hands. The light turned green. I pressed forward into the long, honest night. The city scrubbed clean under its white blanket, and knew with steady certainty that this was only the first knot I had cut. There were others, tighter, older, waiting their turn. I didn't head home. Instead, I turned at the light and kept going until the glow of the hospital faded behind me, swallowed by the dull hum of a strip mall. The UPS store still had its Christmas Eve hours taped crookedly on the door. Inside, it smelled of toner and cardboard, the air tired with effort. The clerk, a kid in a red beanie with tape clinging to the sleeve, looked up and asked if he could help. I dropped the heavy envelope on the counter. 7 certified, return receipt. He slid the green cards across without asking questions. I wrote each name slowly, block letters deliberate, so no one could claim they hadn't understood them later. One for Ethan, Carter, and Maddie, courtesy copies. Another for the county recorder. Then the bank, the securities bureau, my attorney Marlene, Frank Doyle, and finally the ledger's only reporter who still called after hours. The clerk stamped them one by one, the punch of the machine like a tiny gavel finding its mark. When it was done, he pushed the receipts toward me. "Tonight's fine," he said, giving me a smile that tried for cheer. "Merry Christmas." I gathered the slips into a neat row on the passenger seat. Once I was back in the car. The heater sighed, the snow outside drifting sideways like it understood what it meant to fall with dignity. I thought about what I'd told Ethan, that I had burned the old letters. It was true, just not yet. A couple of knots still needed loosening. The phone buzzed against the console, Marlene's name on the screen. She opened without preamble, her voice sharp but steady. Tell me you didn't sign anything without me. I told her I'd done better. I'd signed a pause, not a surrender. She exhaled, and in her pause I heard the relief of someone used to salvaging wrecks. You do sharp things without dirty ones, she said. Approval disguised as warning. Soon Frank was patched into the call, his voice gravel laced with warmth. You were right about the boy, he admitted. Didn't want to believe it, but we did. Some of us needed to hear it from someone who wasn't selling us more lies. He didn't gloat, and I didn't either. He promised 2 more investors willing to go on record. Civil suits first, regulators later if they had the appetite. Plans arranged themselves with the practiced rhythm of people who had lived too long in someone else's storm. We exchanged the words people say when momentum is finally rolling without them. Be safe, talk soon, then silence. The hospital loomed again as I drove, lights softened by glass, automatic doors breathing people in and out. I parked where I once had years back, when a wire threaded to my artery had bought me time. In the chapel, the hum of machines overhead was the only hymn. I sat in the back row and thought of Ethan, the boy with the bike chain, the young man with sharp teeth and sharper words, the father trying to hold a pen steady. I thought about the voicemails I left long after his box was full, because I refused to let silence think I'd given up. From my coat pocket, I pulled the rubber-banded bundle of old letters. Their edges were worn from years of waiting. I slid one free, read the lines I already knew. Your birthday is next week. I found a book with maps of cities you've never been to. I returned it to the stack. Not yet. Soon. Outside the chapel, a volunteer wheeled a car of small wrapped gifts. Plush animals, crayons, boxes that hadn't yet learned to break. She smiled when she saw me. You with someone tonight? She asked. Yes, I said. Me. Her smile widened, approval in its simplicity. I stepped back into the cold and drove toward a modest office tucked between big box stores, where a receptionist handed me an envelope marked Unit 3B, a furnished townhome. Utilities included, a soft landing hidden in plain sight. If Ethan signed tomorrow, he'd never know it was me. If not, Maddie would get the call. Mercy works best clean. My phone rang again, an unknown number. The Ledger's reporter introduced herself, crisp and professional. She told me she received my packet already. Holiday habit. She checked her mailbox on nights most people pretended the world had stopped. She made it clear she wasn't chasing scandal. She was mapping patterns. You're comfortable being named? She asked. I'm comfortable being precise, I said. She promised no rush, no cheap shots, only truth at the right pace. That was enough. Later, another call. Linda, a name I had promised myself I'd never hear again. She said Ethan claimed I'd bought the mortgage, humiliated them. I told her I'd offered a cleaner exit. Nothing more. She pressed, reminded me he was just a boy once. I reminded her he wasn't anymore. She asked what I was now. Done. I said, letting the word rest between us. Before hanging up, she gave me a Christmas wish that sounded equal parts brave and cruel. I answered with peace, because some words still mattered to me. At home, the house settled around me like a coat I hadn't realized fit again. I drafted one final email, attaching the exhibit's screenshots and promises written too fast for truth. The facts could sit where they belonged until gravity pulled them down. I hit send. Then I boiled water for tea, because whiskey would have tasted too right tonight. The packet of old letters fanned across the counter, waiting. I tied them up again, clean. At the window, I watched the bare maple cradle the night. My phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Thank you for 3B. Not Ethan. Not Maddie. Someone else. Please don't stop being the kind of man who does a thing no one sees. The clock ticked past 10. Somewhere, fireworks cracked against the snowy sky, brief and vanishing. I turned off the lamp, let the quiet fold around me, and whispered once more into the cold. Peace. I tucked the deed inside a plain envelope and marked it for the 27th. But the electronic filing went in that morning. The countdown had begun. Marlene's voice still echoed in my ear, steady, amused, telling me to breathe like she was reminding me how lungs work. I answered her with a promise. One I repeated until it almost felt natural. When she wished me Merry Christmas, I replied with the word I'd chosen for myself this year: peace. That word lingered as I imagined Ethan's kitchen, the stage where so many small cracks had been rehearsed before the wall finally split. Maddie clutching a mug she never emptied, Ethan's phone flipping face down. Face up, the kids try to read the air like weather they couldn't control. By late morning, my phone lit with a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring out. A voicemail landed before the tone even finished. My son's voice clipped with panic. Something about the bank. I left it unanswered, the December light spilling across the table like a witness. I'd lived long enough to know the sharp line between being needed and being used, and I wasn't about to confuse the two again. Soon after, Carr's article dropped. No shouting headlines, just clean ribs of fact laid bare. Ethan's smiling face at some ribbon-cutting stared back. His charm caught on a lens that had loved him less than he loved it. The words didn't accuse, but they didn't have to. Questions placed in the right order can wound more than accusations. And men like my son despise questions that can only be answered truthfully. Calls kept buzzing, unknown numbers, voices I didn't know. One woman, firm but not unkind, thanked me for stepping forward when most wouldn't. She carried resolve, not fury, and I found myself respecting that difference. I stepped outside into the brittle snow, boots crunching against a crusted surface. I passed the houses with their crooked reindeer, gaudy lights, or no lights at all. A boy on a sled toppled into the yard, his father laughing as they both brushed snow from their sleeves. It was good to hear laughter unchained from obligation. You don't need to belong to a thing to feel warm by it. Back inside, I chose tea instead of whiskey. The kettle's thin whistle matched the rhythm of my resolve. By afternoon, Maddie called, her voice sharp as glass. She accused me of turning private matters into public spectacle. I told her I had lived 2 decades keeping things private. It hadn't worked. Her fury crackled through the phone, and when I reminded her of the lifeline I had left in Unit 3B, she called it charity. I told her it was a door. Whether she walked through it was her choice. She didn't thank me, but I hadn't offered for thanks. As evening pulled its curtain, the texts began arriving. Strangers asking if I was the same Brooks mentioned in Carr's piece. Investors seeking restitution, pleading for answers. I gave none. Marlene had told me to let the paper walk on its own legs, and I trusted her advice. Some plans only prove their worth once you let them breathe, without your hand on the wheel. When Ethan finally called, his voice carried a mixture of defiance and fear. He wanted to meet today. I told him to come at 11, alone. Mercy, when it's offered quietly, lands straighter. The knock came at 11:02. He stood in the doorway, his practiced posture unraveling. He looked more like the boy I once raised than the man who had spent years performing strength. I told him to take his shoes off. He did. We sat at the table, the silence between us thicker than any words. He accused me of blindsiding him, of humiliating him. I reminded him I'd set a clock. He'd chosen not to read it. He spread his hands, palms up, insisting this was his life, his family, his kids. I met his eyes and told him it had been my quiet, my name, my years too. What he wanted was money, though he dressed it as legacy, as partnership, as shared ambition. I called it what it was. When he asked what I expected of him now, I gave him the simplest and hardest command: tell the truth, to himself first, then his wife, then the investors, and finally his children. The truth that I had loved him when it was easy, and even when it was not, but that I would no longer let him spend me as if I were currency. He flinched at that, because mirrors are crueler than enemies. He tried to bargain, asking if investors would sue, if they'd lose the house. I told him they wouldn't. The house was already spoken for, a quiet safeguard I'd arranged for the children. He didn't like that answer. Pride rarely does. Still, he listened when I told him his work now was to face the phone calls he once ignored, to start answering even when there was nothing in it for him. His voice cracked once, reverting to the tone of a boy trapped in an oversized coat. He said thank you, though he admitted it wasn't the right phrase. I told him it was right, just not in the way he meant. When he left, moving slower than he'd arrived, I leaned against the door, not from exhaustion, though I carried plenty of that, but out of respect for the wood that had held us both. The messages continued to ping. Investors, neighbors, people asking about keys and units, gratitude arriving without names. I rinsed my cold mug and sat upside down. Across the street, a man spread rock salt carefully across his steps, testing each one with his boot. He admired his small job when it was done, the way men do when the task is simple enough to see complete. My own task was not so simple, but as I looked at the folder on the table, I knew it was at least honest. The most honest map I had ever drawn. The paper on the table was more than paper. It was a mirror, a weight, a path that could either save him or bury him further. He held it like a man afraid that even touching responsibility might scorch his palms. I told him plainly, the town won't wait, won't keep offering polite smiles in coffee shops when the truth is on their screens. He could sign or he could run, but either way I wouldn't change. I had finally learned what it meant to stop bargaining for love. He lingered in the silence, that young old face caught between wanting to call me Dad and still believing that word was owed, not given. When he finally tried it on, halfway in the hallway, I let him have the moment. Just a weather report, no drama. And he left smiling like a boy who'd almost remembered how fathers work. But I didn't expect a call. Men wrestling with themselves don't dial easy. What came instead was Kara, voice brisk, sharp, always professional. Could she quote me? Not sentiment, sentences. The kind the town would chew over their morning eggs. The kind other men would steal for their own speeches, without ever lifting the weight behind them. I gave her the line anyway. I won't finance the lie that broke us. I'll fund the truth that might keep the kids from breaking, too. She said it would make the internet angry. I said good. Anger was a chore. Shoveling snow helped. We hung up, and I ate AL stew over the sink like a man rehearsing widowhood without ever having earned the title. By morning, the first thread snapped. A friend of his, one of those partners who love the promise more than the product, closed a line of credit. No signature, just a cold message. We like our money more. Then came Maddie, her voice catching on the same tremor had the day she gave birth. What's in this folder? She asked, what did you give him? I told her the truth. It wasn't mine anymore. It was his, if he could sign it, if he could carry it. She weighed love against a record of his failures, but still asked the one question I couldn't answer. Would he? I didn't know, but I knew he could. Men lift heavier things when they stop clutching the wrong ones. She went quiet, then asked about the tree outside that cramped rental window. Would it hold birds in spring? Yes, I promised. Finches, maybe a robin, even a squirrel bossing the fence. Her breath softened then, as if she had stepped into a life she hadn't dared to imagine. She thanked me, not for money, not for saving him, but for the children. That thank you lodged somewhere I didn't want to touch, but I let it sit. The school called later. Miss Doyle, careful voice, saying there had been no violence, just words. Kids were passing the article on their phones, mocking Ethan, mocking me. Ava had stood up for her father too fiercely, fists balled at her side. She wanted to talk to me. When her voice came on, small but determined, she asked if we would move. Yes, I said, but the tree would come too. That was how trees worked. No names, no judgments, just shade if you stood under them. She asked if I was mad at her father. No, I said. I was mad at what he'd done, not who he could still become. She let out the sound of a child setting down a heavy backpack. Before hanging up, I made her promise to tell Miss Doyle I'd bring muffins. Teachers deserve more than apologies. By Friday, another partner drifted off. The venture fund wrapped its cowardice in words like evaluating. But I heard the truth. They wanted distance. Kara called again, editor pressing for photo. I joked about Al being better looking, but she pushed. You'll make readers fall in love with you, she said. Then they'll be mad when you're not tidy. I told her America adored clean sins and dirty redemptions. My story was a reverse. That afternoon, Ethan returned. No bluster, no smirk. Just a folder, the pen, and a steady hand. He admitted he'd never forgive me for how I'd done it, but maybe he'd thank me someday. That was enough. He signed, pressing deep enough into the page that I could feel the groove under my fingertip. A man learning to let go even awkwardly. "What now?" he asked. "Work," I said. "Real work." I offered him Louise at the lumberyard. 15 to start, more if he lasted. Honest labor. The kind that leave your back aching but your name cleaner. He laughed, pained. "Stocking 2x4s? Better than debt," I said. "Investors accept money, not promises." And instead of sulking, he called. Left a message like a man doing something he didn't want to do, but knew he must. That's how sentences should end, not with punctuation, but with paychecks. The days stacked up heavy and strange. Linda appeared at my door, polished as ever, carrying Robert's threats of lawsuits and poverty porn. I poured tea and told her truth survived better in sunlight than shade. She called me holy. I said I was simply finished being a wallet. We stood there with old ghosts crowding the room until she finally admitted she'd wanted a winner. I told her she had one, just not the kind that fit a Christmas card. Her eyes watered, but she refused to let them fall. She left with her purse, her pride, and her grief still knotted up, but the world kept inching forward. Frank sent me a framework, legal and sharp, but carrying the same bones of the plan. If Ethan held steady 6 months, the rest might ease. And when Ethan texted late that night, asking about gloves, answering with an "okay" that cut deeper than any insult ever had, I knew something had shifted. Monday morning before dawn, I stood behind the door as he tapped once, soft, almost polite, and picked up the gloves. No swagger, no demands. Just a man on his way to lift wood, and numbers until they built him something steadier. He looked me in the eye and called me Dad. No performance, no speech. Just 2 letters rebuilt into a bridge. And when he walked away into the cold, the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt used well, as if it had finally remembered why it had been built at all. The wind that Friday morning carried the kind of edge that slices through coats and excuses alike, but it didn't stop the street from filling with the shuffle of cardboard, tape peeling loose, and voices raised over the weight of boxes. I parked a block away, telling myself I wasn't really going to help, only to watch, to be present in the margins of their day. That's the trick. You can let someone carry their own burdens, yet still stand where they can see you if the straps snap. The townhomes at 3B looked sharper in daylight. Winter sun, giving the brick its due. Ava appeared first, dragging a plastic bin across the concrete, her breath puffing steady as determination. Maddie followed, arms full of kitchen pots rattling like reluctant percussion. Jake darted around her with a broom too big for his frame, pretending at competence and nearly knocking the lamp out of her hand. Ethan trailed them all, holding the kind of oversized box that forces you to negotiate every step like a treaty. I stayed by the curb, hands in pockets, until Ava noticed me. She didn't wave, just gave a firm nod, her way of drafting me into acknowledgement without ceremony. Maddie glanced over, suspicion still her armor, and turned back to her load. Jake squinted, uncertain whether my presence meant more rules or maybe pizza. Ethan caught my eye last, and for once he didn't flinch or scowl. He just balanced the box, steady and plain, like work had taught him not everything needed to be dramatized. When I finally stepped closer, I didn't reach for anything. Instead, I offered the kind of advice men pretend not to need. Tilt the box on its edge when you turn, I said quietly. They like that. Ava smirked. Confirmation they'd already discovered the trick, and turned back to the door. The courtyard was filling with half-packed pride. Children claiming their own competence. It wasn't my stage, and I wasn't about to steal applause. The afternoon wore itself down to tired laughter. Pizza boxes open on the floor like treaties everyone could agree on. I didn't sit, didn't stay long. Before leaving, Maddie approached me again, this time without props. Her words came clipped, reluctant but true. "We'll manage," she said. I believed her. "Check the junk drawer for Sharpies," I replied. "Every house hides them there." Her lips twitched at the corner, almost smile, almost forgiveness. It was enough. By evening, I was back in my kitchen, washing a dish I hadn't dirted, making small rituals of silence. That's when the phone buzzed. Kara's latest article had gone live. I read it standing at the counter, light from the stove pooling on the paper. She hadn't written vengeance. She'd written patience. A father learning not to act from spectacle, A son lifting wood instead of excuses. A family charting their alphabet in chalk. Mercy works best when clean, she'd written. I exhaled to the kind of relief that doesn't need witnesses. The next day carried the kind of calm only exhaustion can buy. Ethan had fainted at the yard, they'd said, but was back on his feet, embarrassed enough to learn steadiness. Louise called him steady, a word men treasure more than clever. That night, Ethan sat across from me with a bowl of stew, quiet but present, and for the first time in years he looked like someone who might grow into his work without dragging the wreckage behind him. Between spoonfuls, he lifted his eyes. I'm sorry, he said, not in the way boys test apologies to see if they'll stick, but in the way men place them down like payment overdue. I nodded once, no garnish. I know. He lingered at the door before leaving. Peace, he whispered, as if the word had been waiting its turn all along. I echoed it back, not as advice, not as command, but as recognition. For a moment, the house, the street, the winter itself, all of it felt less like punishment and more like the possibility of rest. And when Friday finally folded itself into night, I realized something simple. You don't always need to lift the boxes. Sometimes it's enough to stand nearby when the tape gives up and let the people you love discover that even when they stumble, the ground is still theirs. The courthouse carried that strange silence that eats even the sound of footsteps, as if walls had grown tired of drama and wanted no echoes left behind. I moved through the metal detectors, the cold of the morning still clinging to my coat, the rubber-banded stack of unsent letters heavy in my pocket. They weren't words I planned to read aloud, only reminders of all the things I had chosen not to say when they might have mattered most. The second-floor conference room had glass that framed the parking lot like a map, cars angled like pawns waiting to be moved. Marlene was already there, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp, sorting folders into perfect rows as though trial prep were a surgeon's table. Morning, she said, clipped but kind. Civil group first, bureau after. Frank's here. She tilted her chin. In the far corner, Frank stood steady, his hands buried in his coat pockets. He looked like a man who'd lived through betrayal and decided to stay upright anyway. His voice was low when he finally spoke. Blizzard coming. They always say that. I murmured. Sometimes it's just weather. He half smiled, but it faded quick. 2 more employees flipped. One's got slack logs that'll make compliance cry. Marlene slid a thick packet toward me. The proposed consent order. Words carved in legal precision. No admission of guilt. Acknowledgement of conduct. A 7-year bar from serving as officer or director. Restitution plan. Quarterly compliance reports. A monetary penalty heavy enough to leave scars. He'll try to shave it down to 5, she said, tapping the page like hammer to nail. Don't react. Bureau won't budge. The bar is everything. The door opened and the court reporter entered, her machine clicking into place like the altar of some quiet faith. Moments later, Kara appeared, shoulders brushed with snow, notebook open before she'd even sat down. Her eyes flicked over the folders. Then to me, an unspoken question about how much longer the storm had to run. The room shifted when the opposing counsel arrived. Ethan trailed behind them, his face pale, the polish stripped from his posture. He avoided my gaze, but I felt the weight of his glance lingering anyway, a silent plea he no longer had the words for. Maddie followed, tight-lipped, her defiance less fire now, more ash. She took a seat across the table, spine rigid, like stillness alone could win background already lost. The negotiations began in a rhythm of measured voices, each side volleying clauses, dates, definitions. Ethan's lawyer argued for leniency, painting him as misguided, overwhelmed, perhaps careless but not malicious. Marlene countered with affidavits, numbers, and the quiet power of whistleblowers who had nothing to gain except the truth. Every so often, Ethan shifted, shoulders tightening, jaw flexing, as though he wanted to interrupt, but couldn't find a gap wide enough to squeeze through. My eyes kept drifting to the snow outside, slow and relentless, covering everything evenly. It made no distinction between guilty and innocent, powerful or weak. Frank leaned toward me once, voice a whisper. This isn't the end, you know. I know, I said. Endings never really come when you expect them. They slip in like drafts under a door, noticed only when a room has already grown cold. At noon, a recess was called. People filed out, murmuring in low tones, the weight of decisions pressing like stones. Ethan lingered, staring at the consent order laid open before him. For the first time in years, he looked less like a man rehearsing victory and more like someone who'd misplaced a script. Our eyes met then briefly. His lips moved around a word that didn't travel the space between us. Maybe help. Maybe why? I didn't answer either way. Some questions don't deserve answers once they've been asked too late. In the hall, Kara caught up with me. He's cracking, she said, voice low. You think he signs? I looked at the snow piling against the courthouse steps. He'll sign, not because he believes in justice, but because he finally sees what happens when belief runs out. She nodded, jotting something in her notebook, though I doubted it was a full truth. Some reckonings can't be written cleanly. They're not headlines. They're shadows lengthening across faces, the silence between words, the way a son finally realizes his father won't be there to pull him out this time. The afternoon wore on, each clause hammered, each stipulation etched into record. Outside, the blizzard thickened, making the world look washed, reset, as though by morning nothing would remain but the shape of choices frozen in the drift. You won't believe how it all came together. The hearing room wasn't a place of drama, but a quiet inevitability, like watching heavy snow collect until a roof groaned under its own weight. Papers shuffled, dates echoed in measured tones, and Ethan finally spoke words that tasted foreign to him. Regret, responsibility, repair. His lawyer's grip on his wrist kept the syllables steady, but his voice cracked where pride had lived too long. No applause followed, no grand gavel strike. Only the sound of printers warming and signatures dragging across paper, marking the end of a chapter nobody wanted but everyone expected. The weight shifted, not in victory but in relief, like a beam finally set down. Outside the chamber, people pretended to breathe easier in little knots of conversation, yet the air stayed taut. Maddie cornered me with her sharp theater of accusation, but I answered simply, leaving her with her heat while I carried my cold mercy. Marlene nudged me toward the hall, and there Ethan waited, eyes tired, voice low. He didn't argue. He asked what I wanted, and I told him. Not excuses, not repayment in speeches, but the slow proof of daily work, the kind that survives without witnesses. He flinched at the demand, then blinked hard when I told him about the trust for Ava and Jake. Not a rescue, but a guardrail, stitched tight with conditions no lie could slip past. Pride whispered in him, but even pride knew better than to roar now. The corridor carried us like a river back to the world. The snow thickening outside, the coach shrugged on with borrowed dignity. I didn't drive home. I drove to a chapel where silence doesn't need permission. I sat with letters I had once written like lifelines and decided not to burn them, but to let them weigh less, to let them be part of the past without commanding the future. Snow blanketed the town, softening edges, muting sound, offering a temporary lie of peace. And for once, I allowed myself to believe it. At home, Al brought his shovel, and we prayed with work, not words. Banana bread arrived like an unexpected blessing. Even a phone call from Ms. Hahn carried small mercies. Rent paid on time, a bird feeder waiting to be discovered. Kara's text came sharp and short. He signed. That single period said more than paragraphs. And I slept, for the first time in years, the way men sleep after storms have already done their damage. Morning brought Ethan at my door, hat crooked, voice softer than I'd ever heard it. He asked about bringing the kids. He called me Dad. Something unglued in me then, just enough for breath to move where it hadn't before. Days blurred into weeks until the chamber breakfast, where Ethan stood with a microphone, no longer a salesman of dreams, but a worker of truth. He admitted the fraud, admitted the excuses, admitted himself. And then he did the only thing that mattered. He pointed to where he'd be every morning, unloading truck 3 at the yard, making restitution not by speeches but by sweat. The town didn't clap. It did something braver. It made space for him without lies. Later, his kids brought chalk, scattering colors on gray sidewalks, rewriting the word grand in their own childlike scrawl. We ate pizza at the table, played board games that required honesty, and I finally carried the old letters to the bin. Not burned, not kept, released. Ava's hand slipped into mine as I closed the lid, and when she asked if the pages would become something else, I said yes, because that's what paper is for. Ethan promised he'd fail sometimes, promised he'd be late, promised he wouldn't ask me to fix it. Good, I told him, because fixing is for people with tools, not fantasies. The days grew ordinary again, which was a miracle. Luis texted me a photo of Ethan in a yellow vest, shoulders squared, pride replaced by work. He wasn't smiling for the camera. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was simply there, solid, grounded, boring in the best way possible. And boring, I realized, pays better than drama ever could. That night, I stood at the door, lights off, listening to the house breathe, the snow melt dripping like a metronome, and I spoke the word that had been waiting all along, not for an audience, not for a gavel, not for applause, but for myself and the ones I loved. Peace. And if this story touched you, if you felt the weight of regret, the fragile strength of forgiveness, or the quiet triumph of choosing work over excuses, don't just leave it here. Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more stories like this, and hit that like button so others can walk this journey with us. Your voice matters. Let's keep telling stories that remind us redemption is possible, even in the quietest rooms.